We're now going to move on to for 5 minutes to Mr. Kram. Mr. Kram, you have the floor once again for 5 minutes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. And my questions are for the witnesses from NAV Canada concerning the closure of air traffic control towers. Last Thursday, Doug Best testified at the committee. He is the president and CEO of the Canadian Air Traffic Controllers Association. And he said, quote, NAV Canada management received bonuses in December worth approximately $7 million, and unionized members got layoff notices, unquote. So could the witnesses from NAV Canada explain, if the federal government gave NAV Canada a $7 million grant tomorrow, how many air traffic control towers on your closure list could have been kept open?
Bohn?
So I just want to highlight again that management employees, I think, were the hardest hit in terms of our workforce adjustment, and definitely in terms of their compensation, both from a salary perspective and as I mentioned earlier, a pension perspective. In terms of how many air traffic controllers we would, how many facilities we would keep open based on any government grant, that we would have to evaluate. Again, we're looking, at transforming an industry and therefore having to transform the services that we offer based not on what we see today, but what we anticipate we're going to see well into the future. And that's how our decisions will be made.
Mr. Kram?
Okay, so when I talk with representatives from the Regina Airport Authority, the last thing on their mind is NAV Canada bonuses. What's at the top of their mind is public safety, future growth after the pandemic is over, and keeping the lights on in the meantime. So how does NAV Canada plan to ramp up to pre-pandemic levels if 7 of its air traffic control towers have been closed down?
Mr. Bohn?
So the decisions that we're making with respect to air traffic control towers are based on air traffic that we saw prior to the pandemic, and that we will see. We anticipate that we will see post-pandemic, and so those changes are not being made based on where we're at today in terms of air traffic levels, and so we will continue to provide the appropriate level of service.
We're done in about 10 minutes.
And the appropriate level of service, always keeping safety at the forefront and in mind of all the decisions that we make.
So before the pandemic in 2019, were air traffic controllers regularly required to work overtime?
Mr. Bohn?
Yes, air traffic controllers would have worked overtime, or many of them would have worked overtime. Overtime is used as a way to balance supply and demand with respect to our services, given that we're a 24/7 operation. We have used overtime to deal with staff shortages in some locations, but even in locations where we're fully staffed, we will use overtime to balance that supply and demand.
Mr. Kram?
And so if NAV Canada was having its controllers work overtime before the pandemic, are these levels of overtime sustainable post-pandemic, or is NAV Canada just expecting dramatically reduced levels of air travel for the foreseeable future?
We are certainly expecting to see significant reductions in air travel in the foreseeable future, but all our plans, including looking at what would be the optimal mix of overtime and regular pay, is factored into how we determine our staffing levels going forward to ensure that we have an extremely safe operation, as we have delivered historically to the Canadian public and to our customers. None of that will change, but the environment has changed, and we have to respond to that environment and ensure that we're providing the appropriate level of service based on where we expect demand to be.
Mr. Kram?
And I believe in your opening statement, you said it would take 6 to 7 years for air travel to return to pre-pandemic levels. Can I ask what modeling you used to come to that conclusion?
So I believe that was Ms. Marshall that had made that comment about 6 to 7 years. But I will say that our current forecast, although we're reviewing it in light of recent government announcements, is that we would not see traffic return to 2019 levels until 2023-24, but that is likely to be pushed out, similar to what Ms. Marshall said earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Bohn. Thank you, Mr. Kram.